All right, so let's get right into it. The story of the United States, well, it's not some simple, straightforward tale of freedom and progress. Not at all. It's a story that was really forged in conflict, built on a fundamental, and let's be honest, often brutal contradiction. To really get a handle on the nation today, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, where two powerful and totally opposing ideas were planted at the exact same time. The incredible ideal of freedom and the harsh reality of slavery.
And here it is. This is the line, right? The big one. This single sentence is supposed to be the moral bedrock of the nation, a revolutionary promise of liberty for everyone. It's the story America loves to tell about itself. But here's the thing. From the very moment these words were put on paper, they were in a head-on collision with what was actually happening on the ground.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the timeline. Look at that date, 1619. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia more than 150 years before the Declaration of Independence was even a thought. So you see, these ideals of liberty and self-governance didn't just appear in a vacuum. They grew up right alongside the institutions of slavery and the violent takeover of Native American lands. This wasn't some problem that came later, it was baked in from the very start.
So how in the world do you build a country on such a fractured foundation? Well, that's really the story of the nation's birth. It was this massive attempt to create a government based on liberty, while at the same time making a conscious, deliberate compromise on that very ideal just to hold the whole thing together. You know, the whole fight against Britain was really a fight to make self-governance a real thing. It all started with arguments over taxes. The colonists felt like their basic rights were being trampled on. The slogan was simple and powerful: no taxation without representation. But as things got more and more heated, this fight for rights morphed into something way bigger, a full-blown war for independence, a fight to create a whole new kind of nation.
So after the war, they faced this huge challenge. How to unite 13 very different states into a single country? The answer was the Constitution, and it was, a brilliant framework for government. But, and this is a huge but, to get everyone to sign on, a deeply painful compromise had to be made. The very document that established a government by the people also protected the institution of slavery. It even counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for political representation. And just like that, the contradiction wasn't just an idea anymore, it was written into the law of the land.
For a little while, it seemed like this fragile union might actually hold. But a new force was about to come along and push the nation's core conflict to its absolute breaking point: the relentless, unstoppable drive to expand west.
This whole idea had a name: Manifest Destiny. It was this belief, this feeling, that the United States had some kind of divine mission to spread its values all the way across the continent. But with every new mile the country gained, one single explosive question dominated every single debate. Would these new territories be free, or would they allow slavery?
So for decades, politicians just kept trying to patch things up, to kick the can down the road with these compromises. You had the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. Each one was just a temporary fix designed to keep the balance of power between free and slave states from tipping over. But that's all they were, temporary. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically said, let the settlers figure it out, led to outright warfare and what became known as Bleeding Kansas. It was a horrifying preview of what was coming for the rest of the country.
By the middle of the 19th century, the time for compromises was just over. That fundamental conflict, the one between America's ideal of freedom and its reality of slavery, was about to tear the country in two.
And the final straw, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, his party's main goal wasn't to end slavery where it already existed, but to stop it from spreading into new territories. For the slave-holding South, this was a threat to their entire way of life. So South Carolina decided it was out, seceding from the Union. 10 other states quickly followed, and they formed the Confederacy.
And that was it. The talking stopped. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal fort. The Civil War had begun. The nation was now literally at war with itself, fighting over the very meaning of its own existence.
The human cost was, well, it's almost impossible to comprehend. Over 4 years of unbelievably brutal fighting, an estimated 620,000 Americans died. To put that in perspective, that's more than in World War I and World War II combined. This was the terrible, terrible price of the nation's founding contradiction, a debt that was finally being paid in blood.
What's really interesting is that the war itself changed over time. At first, Lincoln's main goal was just to save the Union, to hold the country together.
But with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, he completely redefined the conflict. It was no longer just a war to preserve the nation, but a war for freedom. It was an attempt to finally make the country's reality match its highest ideal.
Then, in April of 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant. The fighting was over, the Union had survived, and slavery was destroyed. But the even harder work, rebuilding an entire country and figuring out what freedom really meant for everyone, that was just getting started.
This next chapter is called Reconstruction, and you have to understand, this was an incredible moment. It was the United States' first real attempt at creating a truly multiracial democracy, a radical effort to completely remake the South and actually deliver on the promise of freedom. And just look at what happened. In just 5 short years, 3 revolutionary amendments were added to the Constitution. The 13th got rid of slavery for good. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection to everybody born here. And the 15th guaranteed the right to vote for black men. On paper, this was it. This was the moment the nation's founding contradiction was supposed to be resolved, once and for all. But that promise, it didn't last long. In 1877, to settle a messy presidential election, a backroom deal was struck. The federal troops who had been in the South protecting these new rights, they were pulled out. And without that protection, the amazing gains of Reconstruction were just taken apart, piece by piece. The promise of equality was abandoned, a promise that wouldn't really be taken up again for nearly another 100 years.
So here's the real takeaway. The Civil War absolutely settled the question of slavery and whether the U.S. would remain one country. But it didn't end that deeper struggle over the nation's soul. That conflict between the ideal of equality and the realities of race and power, it continues to this very day. And that brings us to the big question, the one we're left with. How does that original story, that founding contradiction, still define the United States that you and I see all around us?